Hello, I'm delighted to be presenting for the Spring Research Conference, and thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. Essentially, my research is looking at what does it mean for students to read widely and pick up vocabulary just like a child or kind of a native speaker picks up language. So, essentially, most of my studies looked at extensive reading where students are just encouraged to read for comprehension and how much they pick up other words while doing that. It's a meta-analysis because many studies have been done on this topic, but not as many to give kind of a convincing look at how effective is this approach or is it a valid approach. As you'll see, there's some complexity in the comparison of different studies because of their structure. So in this paper, I looked at two types of studies. Essentially, ones that had only an experimental group, where a class, for example, was allowed to read many graded readers, like, for example, Shelley's Frankenstein, only rewritten for a lower level of English as a second language learner. Or studies that did have a clear control group as well as an experimental group. So using this branch structure, very simply comparing control groups to no effect, and then also separately comparing experimental groups to no effect, breaking up some of the studies that had both control and experimental, and then also including 4 of the studies that only had experimental components. I was able to improve on some of the meta-analytic designs of other inquiries into the topic and get a feel for how much of an improvement this is to more typical approaches like intensive reading or going through a passage and talking about the meaning, but also vocab words, the grammar. Here's a funnel plot of the different studies. As you can see, the purple is control groups, and the green is experimental groups. As you look at it, you can drill down and look at, for example, Daskalovska had 2 different arms of her study, a control group 1 and experimental group 1, as well as a control group 2 and an experimental group 2. And you can look at how essentially the control groups both are a slightly lower level and then hop up to a higher level when compared to the experimental groups. Funnel plots are used as a method to determine bias and look at it, and the design seems relatively free from bias in that, as you might expect, the different studies fall on both sides of a mean difference of 0. There are some outliers like the Rafat Bakash and Alavi experiment. Their second experimental group had a very, very, very high return, and they actually had some additional components where students were working with an online tool as well as extensive reading. On a more traditional extensive reading program, Rafat Bakash and Alavi Experimental 1, there were some modest gains as well. Also for Lidowanis, there seemed to be, a very big difference compared to no effect, and then a very large experimental difference as well. And then Nakanishi right at the top is probably the largest study, and you can see it's a little below the 0. So when comparing each study by itself, it looks as though there's not an inordinate amount of bias, and also that the studies are able to show, with some exceptions like the Yamamoto study, that extensive reading or lots of reading or exposure to comprehensible input without as much focus on explicit instruction of grammar is able to get comparable results on different measures like vocabulary acquisition, or even in some studies the ability to identify the part of speech, or even looking at grammar improvement, many of them centered around vocabulary acquisition. So looking at the data, and especially the p-scores, the experimental groups seem to be the most likely to be, showing a difference as compared to the control groups. But it's still not within the realm of, a very low p-score, less than 0.05. So part of that might be when you look at the confidence interval, there's a very wide range for the control groups, and also the sample size is smaller. So that helps demonstrate that there weren't as many studies controlling for an intensive reading group compared to an extensive reading group. It's a smaller sample size, so the analysis has a much wider confidence interval, which overlaps with the experimental group. For this reason, while it does look as though there's a total difference of about 0.25 when comparing the two groups, it's not demonstrable in a statistically significant way. I do think, though, it's a helpful finding in that experimental groups that used an extensive reading methodology did have returns that, at the least, I would argue, are comparable to the control groups. For that reason, it's not a, policy mandating demonstrable difference, but community groups like reading groups like a book club, as well as just extensive reading programs in schools, are very fungible. They're very doable for even volunteer organizations or nonprofits, and it's a legitimate mode to pursue, especially in the advent of text being more available through the internet, it being a more egalitarian structure for students to be in a book club, for example, together, and also artificial intelligence-based reading recommenders as well as text generators. So in further research, I'll be looking at artificial intelligence models generating text, as well as hopefully looking at recommending texts based on an item response theory model of students' skill level or proficiency level. So thank you very much. And because it's a meta-analysis, there are over 20 sources, and I encourage you to look at the paper, and please research any of those different studies that are of interest. Thank you so much for your time.